Imagine every happy memory you own suddenly becoming a lie. Today was our 10th anniversary, but while I was holding our wedding album, my husband was popping champagne with my childhood best friend. I'm not just losing a marriage. I'm forced to reconstruct a decade of fake smiles and calculated betrayal. My name doesn't matter. What matters is that 3 days ago, I was the kind of woman who still believed in her marriage. I want to tell you exactly how that ended, because I think some of you need to hear it. Not for sympathy, for the version of yourselves that's still making excuses for someone who stopped deserving them a long time ago. I'm 34 years old. My husband, Daniel, is 36. We met in college, got married 5 years later, and this week was supposed to be our 10th wedding anniversary. 10 years. A full decade of birthdays, holidays, a mortgage, 2 dogs, and more inside jokes than I could count. My childhood best friend is named Melissa. We met in second grade. She was in my wedding. She stood 2 feet away from me while I said my vows to Daniel. She gave a toast at the reception that made half the room cry. For 26 years, I thought Melissa was the one person in my life who would never, under any circumstances, hurt me. I want to walk you through exactly how I found out, because the order matters. It shapes everything that came after. 3 days ago, on a Tuesday, Daniel told me he had a work trip, said it was sudden, some regional meeting he needed to fly out for back by Thursday night. I didn't think twice. Daniel travels for work fairly often. I kissed him goodbye, told him to text me when he landed, and went about my week. Wednesday, Melissa texted me, said she was also traveling, visiting her sister for a few days. Could I feed her cat? I said, of course. I've had a key to her apartment for over a decade. This is not unusual for us. Thursday morning, our actual anniversary, I woke up to flowers on the counter. Daniel had ordered them to be delivered. A small gesture, a card that said, 10 years down, forever to go. I remember standing in the kitchen holding that card and feeling, for one brief moment, like maybe I was the luckiest woman alive. That afternoon, I decided to surprise him. I'd found out his meetings were wrapping early, and I thought, why not fly out, surprise him at the hotel? Do something spontaneous for once in our very unspontaneous marriage. I told my sister the plan. She thought it was sweet. I booked a flight for that same evening. I landed around 7. I had the hotel name from an email confirmation I'd seen weeks earlier when he was, according to him, planning logistics. I took a cab straight there, no luggage, just my purse and the wedding album I'd grabbed on my way out the door that morning because I'd been looking through it the night before and hadn't put it back on the shelf. I want you to sit with that detail for a second. I was holding our wedding album when I walked into that hotel lobby. I asked the front desk for Daniel's room. They gave me the floor. I took the elevator up, my heart doing that fluttery, excited thing it does before you do something impulsive and romantic. I knocked. No answer. I could hear voices, though, laughter, muffled through the door. I figured he had colleagues over, maybe a small gathering winding down from the conference. I used the hotel app on my phone, the one linked to our shared travel account, to check if there was a digital key option, thinking I'd surprise him properly by walking in. There was. I let myself in. The first thing I saw was 2 champagne flutes on the desk, a bottle in an ice bucket, rose petals scattered across the bed, an actual happy anniversary balloon tied to the desk chair. My first thought, genuinely, was that he'd planned something incredible for us, and I'd ruined the surprise by showing up early. Then I saw them come out of the bathroom together. Daniel in a robe. Melissa in one of the hotel's robes too, her hair still damp. I don't remember screaming. My sister told me later, from what I described to her, that I probably did, because the front desk called security to the floor within minutes. What I remember is silence. A very specific kind of silence where your brain simply refuses to process information fast enough to make sound. Melissa said my name first. Not Daniel. Melissa. She said it like she was going to explain something reasonable. Daniel didn't say anything for almost 30 seconds. I counted, because I was staring at the second hand on the clock on the nightstand, unable to look at either of their faces. When he did speak, the first full sentence out of his mouth was, "This isn't what it looks like." Which is, I've since learned, the single most common thing men say in exactly this situation, which somehow makes it worse, not better, because it means I'm not even special. I'm a cliché. I asked how long. Neither of them answered right away. I asked again. Melissa was the one who finally said 2 years. 2 years. Our 8th anniversary, every holiday since. Every phone call where she'd asked how my marriage was going. Every time she'd sat across from me at brunch and let me vent about normal marriage stuff. Mortgage stress, wanting kids someday, feeling like Daniel had been distant lately. She knew why he was distant. She was the reason. I want to be very clear about something because I know some of you are already forming opinions about what I should have noticed. I didn't notice because I trusted them. Both of them. Completely. That's not naivety. That's what trust is supposed to look like. The betrayal isn't a reflection of my judgment. It's a reflection of their character. I picked up the wedding album, still in my hands this entire time, and I did the only thing that felt right in that moment. I set it down on the bed, in the rose petals between the two of them, and I walked out. I didn't yell. I didn't throw anything. I've watched enough of these stories to know that the version of me who screamed and broke things would have made a scene the hotel staff remembered, made me the unstable one, given Daniel a narrative where he got to comfort his understandably shaken wife while quietly building his defense. I wasn't going to give him that. There's a term psychologists use for what happens in your head in a moment like that. Cognitive dissonance. It's the specific kind of mental static that hits you when two things you believe at the same time cannot both be true. An hour earlier, my belief was simple. I am loved by my husband, and I am loved by my best friend. Standing in that room, the new reality was that the two people who'd built the entire architecture of my adult life had been quietly constructing a second life I wasn't invited into. Your brain doesn't process that shift the way it processes normal bad news. It short circuits. That's why I don't remember screaming. That's why I remember silence instead. It wasn't calm. It was a mind trying to hold two impossible things at once and failing. By the time I was in the elevator heading down to the lobby, that silence had already started turning into something else, a kind of forced, involuntary audit. My brain, completely without my permission, started pulling up old files and stamping them with a question mark. Every late night he'd called work stress. Every time Melissa and Daniel had an inside joke at dinner that I laughed along to without really being in on it. The trip 2 summers ago where the two of them went to get ice from the machine down the hall and came back 20 minutes later, and I remember being mildly annoyed about the melted drinks and nothing more than that. In the space of one elevator ride, 10 years of ordinary, forgettable moments were being refiled as evidence. I want to say something directly to anyone who has lived through this specific kind of refiling, because I think it's one of the cruelest parts of this whole experience, and almost nobody talks about it. You did not miss the signs because you're gullible or slow or bad at reading people. You missed them because you are a person who is fundamentally incapable of imagining that level of calculation in someone you love. That's not a flaw. It's the same trait that made you a good partner and a good friend in the first place. The people who did this to you didn't outsmart you. They exploited the exact quality in you that made you worth loving. The lawyer told me something I've repeated to 3 friends since. She said, "The person who moves first, calmly, and with documentation, almost always ends up in the stronger position. The person who reacts emotionally in public loses leverage, even when they're the wronged party." That sentence became my entire strategy for the next 2 weeks. Before I walk you through what I did next, I want to back up and tell you a little about the marriage itself because I think it matters for understanding why the discovery hit the way it did and why I responded the way I did instead of falling apart entirely. Daniel and I met in a college economics class neither of us particularly cared about. He made a joke about the professor's tie in the second week that made me laugh loud enough to embarrass myself. And that was, more or less, the beginning. We dated for 5 years before he proposed on a beach during a trip his parents had actually paid for, which I only found out years later, and which, in hindsight, tells you something about how much of our relationship was quietly subsidized and softened by other people's effort. We got married in a small ceremony, 60 guests, at a vineyard 2 hours from where we grew up. Melissa gave a toast about how she'd known me since we were 7 years old, since the day I'd shared my crayons with her on the first day of second grade, and how she'd never seen two people more suited for each other than Daniel and me. People cried. I cried. I remember thinking in that exact moment that I was the luckiest woman in that room because I had both the partner and the best friend together, celebrating me. I'm telling you this because I need you to understand that this wasn't a fragile marriage that finally cracked under pressure. By every visible measure, for 8 of our 10 years together, it looked solid. We bought a house in year 4. We talked casually about children, though we hadn't started trying yet. We had a rhythm, Sunday morning coffee on the porch, a shared spreadsheet for finances that I, admittedly, maintained more diligently than he did, a running joke about which one of us would finally learn to cook something besides pasta. Somewhere around year 8, subtle things changed, the kind of things you explain away in real time and only recognize in hindsight. Daniel started going to the gym more, which I thought was just him taking better care of himself. He started taking calls in the other room, which I assumed was work stress. He and Melissa started texting more frequently, but I never once thought to question it, because why would I question the two people I trusted most talking to each other more? If anything, I was glad they got along so well without me having to broker it. There was one moment, almost a year before the hotel, that I've replayed more than any other since. Melissa and I were having lunch, just the two of us, and she asked me, almost too casually, whether Daniel and I were happy. I remember laughing and saying, "Of course, why?" And she said she just worried about me sometimes, that marriages need attention. At the time, I thought she was being a good friend. Now I understand she was measuring how much I knew, testing the waters of a lie that was already well underway. I share that detail because I think it's important for anyone watching this who is currently doing the mental gymnastics of, but there were no signs. There are almost always small signs. The betrayal isn't in missing them. The betrayal is entirely, 100% on the people who created them and then hid behind your trust. Now, back to the hotel room and everything that followed. I want to walk you through what I actually did, step by step, because I think the specifics matter more than the emotion here. Step 1. I did not go home. I stayed at my sister's and had her drive me back only when Daniel was confirmed to be elsewhere, to collect essential documents. Passport, birth certificate, the deed paperwork, tax returns, tucked into a bag before he even knew I'd been there. Step 2. I opened a new checking account in my name only, at a different bank than the one we shared, and had a portion of my paycheck redirected there starting with my very next pay cycle. Nothing dramatic. Just enough that I had breathing room that wasn't tied to a joint account he could freeze or drain out of spite. Step 3, and this one matters most. I quietly gathered evidence. Not because I needed proof for myself, I'd seen it with my own eyes, but because divorce proceedings and infidelity, depending on your state, can affect things like alimony and asset division, and because I knew Daniel well enough to know he'd try to rewrite the story the moment he had an audience. I saved the hotel booking confirmation email that had tipped me off in the first place. I screenshotted the regional meeting text he'd sent me before he left. I kept a written timeline, dated, of every phone call and message from that week. I am, by nature, an organized person. For once, that trait was working entirely in my favor. Step 4. I told exactly 2 people before I told anyone else, my sister and my mother. I called my mother 2 days after the hotel, sat her down over the phone, and told her plainly. My mother's first reaction was silence, then anger. Real anger, the kind that made me realize where I get my restraint from, because she said, very calmly, "Don't do anything yet. Let me think." My mother, it turns out, thinks exactly like I do. Here is where the story takes its first real turn, because Daniel wasn't sitting quietly during any of this. By day 3, Daniel had shown up at my sister's house twice. The first time, Rachel didn't even open the door, just spoke to him through it, told him I wasn't ready to talk and that showing up uninvited wasn't going to change that. The second time, he brought flowers, an almost insulting echo of the anniversary bouquet still wilting on our kitchen counter at home. And Rachel told him if he came back a third time, she'd consider it harassment and act accordingly. He didn't come a third time, but he did start calling family. Not mine, his. And in a move I genuinely did not see coming, he called Melissa's family too, apparently trying to get ahead of the story before I could tell it myself. This is where I learned something important about Daniel that 10 years of marriage hadn't fully revealed. He is, at his core, a man who manages perception before he manages truth. Within a week, I started hearing secondhand, through a cousin of his who still liked me, that Daniel's version of events painted things as complicated, that he and Melissa had been growing apart from their respective relationships and gravitating toward each other emotionally for a while. Language that made a 2-year physical affair sound like a slow, sympathetic drift, rather than a decade of deliberate lying. I want to pause here and say something directly to anyone watching this who has been on the receiving end of this specific kind of manipulation. The moment someone starts softening the language of what they did to you, before they've even faced you, that is not remorse. That is damage control. Genuine remorse doesn't need a script. It doesn't need to get ahead of the narrative. It sits in the discomfort of what it did. I decided, at that point, that I was done letting Daniel control the story. My family has always been close. The kind of family that does a big holiday gathering every year, extended relatives included. My parents' house filled with aunts, uncles, cousins. This year's gathering was 3 weeks out. Daniel knew this. Melissa knew this too, because she'd been coming to these gatherings with me for over 2 decades. Technically as my +1 best friend, long before she became anyone's +1 anything else. Daniel, through his cousin, let it be known he assumed things would eventually calm down enough for him to still attend, given how long he'd been part of the family. That single piece of information told me everything about how little he understood what he'd done or how little he cared. So here's what I did instead of confronting him directly. I called my mother back, and together we made a decision. Instead of a screaming confrontation, instead of drama at a family event, we were going to let the truth simply exist in the room, clearly, calmly, undeniably, in front of the people who mattered most, and let Daniel and Melissa's own actions do the damning. 2 weeks before the gathering, I filed for divorce. Not dramatically, not with a public announcement, just quietly, through my attorney, citing irreconcilable differences, with the infidelity documented as part of the record where it was legally relevant. Daniel was served at his office. My attorney told me later that he'd apparently gone visibly pale in front of 2 colleagues, and I won't pretend that detail didn't bring me a small, quiet satisfaction. The week of the gathering, I informed my mother, my father, my sister, and exactly one trusted aunt of the full timeline, with documentation, not for gossip, but so that if Daniel arrived and tried his softened, sympathetic version of events, the people around us already had the truth. Daniel did try to come. He showed up at my parents' house the day of the gathering as though nothing had changed, dressed for the event, a bottle of wine in hand like he always brought. 10 years of that exact gesture now looking almost grotesque in context. My father answered the door. My father is not a man of many words, but the words he chose that day were precise. He told Daniel that he was welcome to send divorce paperwork through lawyers, but he was not welcome in that house today or, as far as my father was concerned, ever again. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. Melissa didn't attempt to come. I think, in the end, some awareness of shame did exist in her, even if it arrived 2 years too late to matter. I want to tell you about the conversation I finally did have with Daniel, 3 weeks after the hotel, because I think people expect a screaming match, and what actually happened was almost anticlimactic, which felt like its own kind of victory. We met at my attorney's office, with both attorneys present, ostensibly to discuss the division of the house. Daniel tried, several times, to steer the conversation into an apology, into an explanation, into something that resembled the beginning of a reconciliation conversation. I let him get about 2 sentences in each time before redirecting the conversation back to logistics. Whose name goes on the house listing? How the joint savings get split? What happens to the dogs? At one point he said, quietly, almost pleading, "Don't you want to know why?" And I told him the truest thing I've ever said to him in 10 years of marriage. I said, "I already know why. You wanted her, and you didn't want to lose the comfort of me finding out, so you kept both for as long as you could get away with it. There's no version of an explanation that changes that." He didn't have a response to that. For the first time in our entire relationship, Daniel was speechless, and it wasn't romantic, it wasn't dramatic, it was just quiet, the same quiet I'd been carrying since that hotel room. There is one more conversation I haven't told you about yet because I saved it for last on purpose. About 5 weeks after the hotel, Melissa called me. Not texted. Called, which she almost never did, which told me before she said a word that this wasn't going to be casual. I almost didn't answer. Part of me wanted to let it ring out forever, to give her the same silence she'd apparently been comfortable giving my marriage for 2 years. But another part of me, the part that had spent 26 years building an entire understanding of who this person was, needed to hear what she thought she was owed the chance to say. I answered. She was crying before she even got a full sentence out. She said she never meant for it to happen, that it had started small. Dinner as friends while Daniel and I were going through a rough patch she claimed to have noticed before I did. That one thing had led to another, that she'd hated herself every single day for 2 years and just didn't know how to stop. I let her finish completely before I said anything, because I wanted to make sure I understood the full shape of the excuse before I responded to it. When she finished, I asked her one question. I asked, "In 2 years, was there a single day you almost told me?" There was a long pause. She said there were many days. I asked what stopped her. She said she was scared of losing me. I told her the truth as calmly as I could manage. I said, "You didn't lose me because you were scared of losing me. You lost me the day you chose 2 more years of my friendship under false pretenses over one hard conversation that would have actually respected me enough to let me make my own choices." I told her that scared or not, she'd had 26 years of practice being my best friend, which meant she, more than almost anyone alive, understood exactly what this would do to me, and she chose to do it anyway, for 2 years, repeatedly, with intention. She didn't have an answer for that. I didn't expect her to. I told her I wasn't interested in staying in contact, wished her well in the flattest, most final tone I could manage, and ended the call. I haven't spoken to her since, and I don't intend to. I want to say something here for anyone who's been on the receiving end of a friend's betrayal specifically, because I think it sometimes gets treated as a lesser wound than a partner's betrayal, and in my experience, it isn't. In some ways, it cuts deeper, because a partner is one person you chose as an adult. A childhood best friend is woven into the entire architecture of who you became. Losing that isn't just losing a friendship, it's losing a witness to your whole life. I'm still grieving that, honestly, more some days than I'm grieving Daniel. The house sold 4 months later. Because of the quiet account my mother had encouraged years earlier, and because I'd moved quickly and calmly instead of emotionally, I walked away from that marriage in a stronger financial position than Daniel did, which I know isn't the point for everyone, but for me, it mattered. It meant I wasn't starting over from nothing. It meant a decade of my own quiet discipline had actually protected me, even before I knew I'd need protecting. As for Melissa, I heard through mutual, increasingly former friends that she and Daniel are still together, that they moved in together almost immediately after everything became public, as though 2 years of secrecy had been unbearable, and they were relieved to finally stop hiding. I also heard, and I'll admit I didn't hate hearing this, that most of our shared friend group quietly stopped inviting either of them to anything. Not out of some dramatic boycott, just a slow, natural erosion of two people nobody quite trusted the same way again. My family, on the other hand, closed ranks around me instantly and completely. My mother calls me every single week now, just to check in, something she didn't do as consistently before. My sister has become, in the truest sense, my closest friend, the person I actually talk to about hard things now, the role Melissa used to hold and clearly never deserved. I moved into a small apartment on my own for the first time since college. It's smaller than the house, quieter in a way that used to feel unbearable, and now, most days, feels like relief. I adopted one of our two dogs, the older one, the one who used to sleep at the foot of our bed every single night for 8 years, and some evenings I catch him staring at the door like he's still waiting for Daniel to walk through it. I understand the feeling. Grief doesn't disappear just because the person who caused it deserved to lose you. The first few months were harder than I let most people see. There were nights I sat on the floor of that new apartment, surrounded by half-unpacked boxes, and cried in a way I hadn't let myself cry back when I was still in strategy mode, still building my case, still protecting myself. I think that's an important thing to say out loud, because I don't want anyone watching this to think that handling something calmly means you don't feel it just as violently underneath. I felt every bit of it. I just refused to let Daniel or Melissa be the ones who got to witness it. Work, oddly, became a kind of anchor. I threw myself into projects I'd been putting off for years, took on responsibilities I might have avoided before, out of some unconscious instinct to keep my schedule compatible with a marriage that no longer existed. 6 months in, I got a promotion I hadn't even been actively pursuing, and I remember sitting in my car afterward and laughing, out loud, alone, at the strange unfairness of grief, that it can exist in the very same season as genuine, unrelated growth. My sister and I started a standing Sunday dinner, just the two of us, something we'd never done before because Sundays used to belong to Daniel and me. Now they belong to Rachel and me, and if I'm honest, it's become one of my favorite parts of the week. My mother calls every Wednesday without fail just to ask how I'm doing. No agenda, no advice unless I ask for it. I didn't realize how much I needed that kind of quiet, consistent presence until I finally had it. I think about that hotel room sometimes, the rose petals, the champagne, the wedding album sitting there between them. I've wondered why I set it down instead of taking it with me, and I think the answer is that some part of me, even in that moment, understood that the marriage in that album had already ended long before I walked in. I wasn't leaving a photo album behind. I was leaving behind a decade I'd spent believing in something that had quietly stopped being true 2 years earlier. If you're watching this and you recognize even a small piece of your own story in mine, I want to leave you with the only advice that actually helped me. Don't perform your pain for the person who caused it. Document. Protect yourself financially before you protect your feelings. Choose the people who show up without needing to be asked, and let go, completely and without apology, of the ones who didn't. 10 years down. Not forever after all. But I'm still here, and for the first time in longer than I realized, every smile I have left is actually mine. Would you have confronted them in that hotel room or walked away like I did? Let me know in the comments, and subscribe for more family betrayal stories like this.